I filed the report on the 43rd day after the siege broke. I had been putting it off. Not because I lacked the facts. I had more facts than I knew what to do with. Logs and sensor sweeps and docking manifests and 3 separate testimony transcripts, all of them saying the same thing in slightly different ways, but because I did not know how to begin. In the Empire's intelligence apparatus, a report that cannot be categorized is a report that does not get read. And what happened at Verath Station in the autumn of the Sovereignty's 472nd year did not fit any category I had ever been trained to write. I gave it a category in the end. I called it a communications anomaly with compound origin and unsolicited third-party intervention. My supervisor approved the filing without comment. I do not think he read it. That was probably for the best. Let me tell you what actually happened. Verath Station was, when I arrived on assignment 11 months before the siege, a second-tier orbital defense platform above Verath IV. It was not prestigious posting. The station was old, commissioned in the Sovereignty's 390th year, upgraded twice, never rebuilt, and it showed its age in the way that military infrastructure always shows age when nobody with budget authority is paying attention. The tertiary power coupling on the port side had been running at 62% rated capacity for 7 years. The atmospheric recyclers on Deck 9 had a slow leak that maintenance had been promising to patch since before I transferred in, and the communications array had been certified operational on the basis of a calibration test that, as I would later discover, had been conducted with a faulty reference standard, which meant the array was operating at full power, but firing its signal cone approximately 4 degrees off its nominal heading. 4 degrees, that is not much. In practical terms, for communications within the Sovereignty's inner network, 4 degrees of angular error is irrelevant. The relay stations are positioned with enough coverage overlap that a 4-degree offset barely matters. Your signal reaches its destination. You never know there was an error. Where the 4 degrees becomes significant is at range. The distress beacon protocol, the automated emergency SOS that every military installation is required to maintain in ready fire status, is designed to reach the Sovereignty's nearest strategic relay, acquire a handshake, and propagate from there. At the distances involved, a 4-degree offset on the source cone translates to a miss of the intended relay by several light hours. Under most circumstances, this would simply mean the beacon's burst hit a secondary relay instead of the primary, with a modest delay in propagation. What it meant at Verath Station, specifically, on the night of the 18th day of the siege, that night, that hour, that minute, was something else entirely. The siege had begun, as sieges at second-tier orbital defense platforms generally do, without sufficient warning. We were not at war. The Sovereignty was not at war. What we were was the object of a faction within the Dravathi convergence that had concluded, on the basis of some intelligence assessment I was never permitted to see in full, that Verath IV's position along the outer shipping lanes made Verath Station a target worth interdicting. They were not wrong about the strategic value. They were wrong about the ease of the operation. They brought 4 cruisers and a carrier. Verath Station was built for a garrison of 300. We were running 140, because the Sovereignty's logistics authority had been redistributing garrison personnel to higher priority installations for the better part of 2 years, and the reassignments kept coming, and the replacements kept not arriving. And then one day you have 4 enemy cruisers in your sensor range and 140 people on the station, and the supply convoy that was supposed to arrive 6 weeks ago still somewhere in the backlog. I am an intelligence officer. My job, broadly, is to know things. In the 11 months I had been at Verath Station, I had developed a precise understanding of our vulnerabilities. The power coupling, the recyclers, the comms array offset, the gap in our point defense grid on the ventral arc, the fact that our garrison commander, a reasonable man named Harvin Solis, who had been waiting out his last assignment before retirement, had last run a full combat drill 14 months before I arrived. I knew all of this. I had filed 3 separate reports about it through the standard intelligence channels. The reports had been received, acknowledged, and filed. No action had been taken. On the first day of the siege, Commander Solis was killed when a Dravathi strike craft put a shot through the command-level viewport before our point defense grid had fully cycled to active status. The shot took out the viewport, the primary command console, and Solis himself, who had been standing at the console, attempting to reach the Sovereignty's strategic relay with a priority distress call. His deputy, a younger officer named Veth Karen, assumed command of the station's defense. I assumed, functionally, everything else. What I mean is that the intelligence officer became the person who understood how the station actually worked, which meant the intelligence officer became the person everyone came to when something needed to be understood. I did not mind. It was, in its way, the job. The first 18 days of the siege were a systematic stripping of our capabilities. The Dravathi were patient. They did not attempt a direct assault on the station. They were not, I think, configured for that kind of operation, and Varath Station's hull, for all its age, was built to absorb punishment. What they did instead was interdict our supply lanes, destroy our 2 courier drones in the first 36 hours, and methodically work on our external sensor array with precision fire from long range. By the 18th day, we had lost primary sensors on the dorsal and port arcs. Our fuel reserves for the station's maneuvering thrusters were at 11%. The tertiary power coupling had given up the last of its capacity, and we were running the portside systems on emergency backup. And we had 41 wounded, 9 of them critical, in a medical bay that had been designed for a garrison of 300 and was now being run by a single physician and 2 medics. What I have not fully described, and what the official report does not capture, is what those 18 days felt like from the inside. Reports deal in metrics, power percentages, casualty counts, supply windows, days elapsed. They do not deal in the quality of the silence on Deck 7 at the 3rd hour of the morning watch, when you are the only person awake in the secondary command room, and the station is groaning faintly from stress loads. It was never designed to carry for this long. And the casualty list is 22 names, and you have memorized all of them and their duty stations, and the particular way each of them had looked at you when you passed them in the corridor. And the next meal distribution is 6 hours away, and you are already doing the calculation about whether the rations window holds. They dealt in the small absurdities that siege conditions produce. The Deck 9 recycler leak got worse on day 11, not because anything additional had broken, but because the atmospheric pressure differential had shifted with the portside systems running on backup, and the leak began producing a faint, persistent smell in that section of the corridor, something between warm metal and the recycler's processing medium. That became, after 3 days of exposure, simply a feature of the environment. A fixed point. People oriented themselves by it. I heard a technician say to a colleague, without any irony at all, that she would miss it when it was fixed. They dealt in Veth Karen, who I revised my estimate of sharply during those 18 days. Karen was 31 years old, and he had received command of Varath Station's defense because he was the next senior officer alive, and he handled it with a steadiness that I do not think he had known he possessed before it was required of him. He made decisions quickly. He communicated them clearly. He was wrong sometimes, and when he was wrong he said so, corrected, and moved on without the kind of self-recrimination that slows people down. On day 9, when we lost the dorsal sensor coverage and the nature of our situation became definitive rather than probable, he gathered the 140 people in the largest accessible space on the station and told them plainly where we stood. No softening. No false reassurance. What we have, what we need, what we are going to do. He looked like someone who had decided that the truth was the only thing he had to offer, and had decided it was enough. I respected that. I told him so later that night when the assembly was over and we were back in the secondary command room with the status display and the shrinking numbers. He looked at me with the expression of a man who is not sure whether he has just been complimented or assessed and has decided it probably does not matter. "You filed 3 reports about our vulnerabilities," he said. "Yes." "Before the siege?" "Yes." He looked at the status display. "If they'd been acted on." "If they'd been acted on," I said, "the coupling would have been replaced, the sensor array would have been recalibrated, the point defense grid gap would have been closed, and we would have had a garrison of at least 200. The Dravathi might still have come. The outcome would have been different." Karen was quiet for a moment. Then, "File another one when this is over." "I will," I said. I meant it. The kind of intelligence officer who stops filing reports because the reports are not being acted on is the kind of intelligence officer who has decided that the system is not worth the effort of the truth. I was not that kind. On the 18th day, Veth Karen made the decision to fire the automated emergency beacon. It was the right decision. It was, by that point, the only remaining option for alerting the Sovereignty's strategic command to our situation. Our active communications had been reduced to close-range tactical channels that the Dravathi were monitoring and jamming selectively. The beacon was passive. It would fire a compressed burst on the emergency frequency and propagate through whatever relays it could reach. It was not ideal, but it was what we had. What Karen did not know, because the calibration report had been certified and filed, and nobody had thought to check the reference standard, was that the beacon would fire 4 degrees off its nominal heading. What neither of us knew, because there was no way we could have known, was that a refugee convoy called the Tessevar Transit had been operating in our outer system for the past 9 days, running evacuees from a Dravathi-pressured settlement in the outer belt toward the inner system, and that the Tessevar Transit's lead ship, a converted freighter called the Irrevant, had been hit by Dravathi interdiction fire 6 days before our beacon fired, had been limping on reduced power since then, and had been transmitting its own distress burst on a rotating frequency sweep, including, at the moment that our beacon fired, the same emergency compression frequency. I did not know any of this on the night of the 18th day. I was in the secondary command room, a backup operations center on Deck 7 that we had converted into our functional command post after the primary command level was breached, watching the beacon fire sequence complete on the emergency console and trying to calculate, in my head, how long it would take for the burst to reach the nearest sovereignty relay. The answer, under normal circumstances, was approximately 19 hours. The sovereignty's nearest strategic relay would receive the burst, decode it, flag it as a priority military distress, and propagate it to the strategic command node at Verath Systems Administrative Hub. From there, a response force would be dispatched. The estimated response time, based on the sovereignty's standard protocols and the nearest available response assets, was somewhere between 4 and 7 standard days. We had supplies for 11 days. We had a chance. What I did not know was that our beacon had not reached the sovereignty's nearest relay. Our beacon, offset by 4 degrees, had crossed on nearly the same vector as the Tessevar Transit's distress sweep, and for a period of approximately 40 seconds, the 2 signals had overlapped in space in a way that caused them to interfere constructively on the burst compression frequency, which meant that what propagated outward from that overlap point was not 2 distinct distress signals, but a single merged burst carrying the compressed content of both. The encoding artifacts of the collision layered on top of each other, the origin coordinates of both sources embedded in the signal structure as dual-point metadata that any sufficiently sophisticated relay system would be able to parse. I would not learn any of this until after it was over. At the time, I was watching the beacon fire sequence complete, calculating our supply window, and listening to the distant sound of Drevathi fire on the station's hull. We held for 8 more days. 8 days is a long time when you are rationing water and running your critical systems on emergency backup power, and asking people who are already exhausted to do more. The ration cuts went into effect on day 20. Not severe, we were not at the point of real deprivation, but noticeable, the kind of noticeable that reminds everyone in every meal distribution line that the situation is managed rather than comfortable. People handled it with the particular competence of people who have already spent 18 days handling worse things. There were no complaints about the rations that reached me officially. There were complaints in the corridors, which is different. That is the sound of a functional organization, people grumbling to each other rather than to their superiors, because grumbling to their superiors would require their superiors to formally acknowledge a problem that everyone already knows about and nobody can solve faster. We lost 2 more people, one in surgery on day 22, from complications that our physician Tessavar On described to me afterward in the flat professional language of someone who needs to report a thing precisely, and is using precision to contain what she actually feels about it. One from a hull stress fracture on deck 4, on day 24, when a section of the outer wall that had absorbed 3 hits over the course of the siege finally gave at a seam. The section had been flagged as compromised. The person who died had known it was compromised. They had been checking the seam integrity on the hour as part of the structural monitoring rotation, which is a thing you do when you cannot repair a problem but you can track when it becomes critical. They were checking it when it gave. I kept the casualty list updated. It is not a thing you delegate. We kept the 9 critical wounded stable, barely, through a combination of the physician's competence and a willingness to cannibalize non-essential equipment for medical power allocation. On day 23, the entertainment system for the garrison common room, decommissioned on day 6, its power allocation already redirected, but still physically present, was stripped for its power conversion components, which Tessavar On needed for the critical care monitors. Nobody objected. The entertainment system had not been turned on since day 2. On the 26th day of the siege, at approximately the 14th hour by the station's internal clock, our remaining sensors picked up 3 ships arriving at the outer edge of the system. I was on the observation deck when it happened. The observation deck was technically off-limits. It had taken a hit on day 4 that had cracked the viewport seal and reduced the atmospheric integrity to a level that made it inadvisable to spend extended time there. But the view from the observation deck was the only view we had of the outer system, because our dorsal sensor array was gone, and I had developed the habit of checking it every few hours to watch for Drevathi ship movements. I was wearing a pressure suit. The crack in the viewport was sealed with emergency foam and 3 layers of patch material. It held. I stood at the cracked viewport and watched 3 ships resolve out of transit at the system's outer edge. And I felt, for the first time in 8 days, something that was not quite hope, because hope requires a specific expectation, and I did not yet have one. 3 ships. The Drevathi had 4 cruisers and a carrier. 5 ships. We were watching the situation with the particular attention of people who have been under siege for 26 days and have learned to read sensor returns the way a farmer reads weather. I called down to the secondary command room and told Karen we had contacts. He asked if they were Drevathi. I said I did not know yet. The 3 ships were moving inward on an intercept vector with Varath Station. They were not moving on the evasive heading that Drevathi reinforcements would use. The Drevathi, in our experience, preferred to approach from the stellar pole, using the system star's interference to mask their approach signature. These ships were coming in direct. Fast, but not military fast. Something between a freighter's cruise speed and a warship's full combat transit. Then our passive sensors picked up their identification transponders. I looked at the transponder codes for a long time. I looked at them the way you look at something that does not make sense, waiting for it to resolve into something that does. The lead ship was the ECV Meridian Compact. The second ship was registered as a medical vessel, the hospital ship Kara's Ward. The third was a frigate. Its registry was in a character set I could read because intelligence officers are required to maintain functional literacy in a wide range of encoding systems, and what I was reading was Earth Compact Vessel Registry notation. All three ships were Earth Compact Registry. Earth. I knew what Earth was. Every intelligence officer in the Sovereignty knows what Earth is, in the same way that everyone in the Sovereignty knows what the deep ocean trenches of Verath IV are, a real thing, a known quantity, something you have data on and have categorized and have not in your operational experience ever personally encountered. Earth's compact. Humanity. The species at the far end of the Western transit corridors. They had a reputation, in intelligence circles, for being intensely interested in their own neighborhood, and for answering emergencies with a thoroughness that occasionally surprised people who thought they knew what was coming. They had no treaty with the Sovereignty. They had no known interests in the Verath system. They were not on any list I had ever maintained of potential response assets. 3 Earth Compact ships were in our system, moving toward our station, and I was standing at a cracked viewport on the observation deck in a pressure suit trying to understand why. I called down to Karen and told him what I was seeing. There was a silence on the channel that lasted long enough that I thought the communication had dropped. Then Karen said, "Earth." "Earth," I said. Another silence. "Did we contact Earth?" "No," I said, "we did not contact Earth." I heard him exhale. It was the sound of a man who has been managing a crisis for 26 days, encountering something that is outside the scope of his crisis management framework, and deciding, practically, that it is probably a good problem to have. The Dravathi saw the 3 ships at approximately the same time we did. What happened next told me a great deal about both the Dravathi's intelligence picture and their decision calculus. They moved. Not toward the Earth ships. Away. 2 of the 4 cruisers began maneuvering to increase their distance from Verath Station, shifting to a holding pattern at the outer range of their effective weapon arc. The carrier, which had been positioned between Verath Station and the outer system, began a slow repositioning maneuver that took it out of the direct approach vector of the 3 incoming ships. The other 2 cruisers held their positions, but I watched their power signatures on our passive sensors, and I could read, in the fluctuation of those signatures, a fleet that was reconfiguring from active interdiction posture to something more cautious. The Dravathi, it appeared, knew what Earth Compact registry vessels meant. I did not have time to fully analyze this before the lead Earth ship, the Meridian Compact, opened a channel. Standard hail, multiple frequencies, including our emergency band, they were casting wide, looking for whoever was alive to answer. I answered. My name, my rank, my station designation, and the status of our situation in as few words as I could manage, because I had been through 26 days of siege, and I had learned to be efficient. The voice that came back was human. I had never spoken to a human before in real-time direct communication. They had a particular quality to their diction, a flatness in the lower register, a precision that read as deliberate rather than natural, as though they were concentrating on being understood. The human on the channel said, "Verath Station, this is Meridian Compact, Convoy Commander Usan Darrett. We received a mass-casualty flag from your coordinates and from a second origin point in your outer system. We are on station. What do you need?" I remember sitting down. There was a bench along the observation deck wall, bolted to the hull, old safety equipment from when the deck had been used for routine exterior operations, and I sat down on it, in my pressure suit, at the cracked viewport, and I tried to organize my thoughts. Mass-casualty flag from your coordinates, and from a second origin point in your outer system. A second origin point. "Convoy Commander," I said, I need to ask you something before we proceed with status assessment. You said you received a mass casualty flag from 2 origin points. Can you describe the signal you received? There was a brief pause, transmission delay, perhaps, or Darrett conferring with someone on the Meridian Compact's bridge. Then, we received a merged burst on the emergency compression frequency, origin collision artifact. Our relay parsed 2 embedded coordinate sets from the signal structure. Your station's coordinates, and a second set approximately 4 light hours outward from your position. The mass casualty classification was auto-flagged on both origin sets based on signal content. We were the nearest loaded convoy. We were diverted. I sat on the bench at the cracked viewport, and I worked through what I had just been told. Our beacon had fired on a heading 4 degrees off nominal. The Tessevar Transit's lead ship, the Irrevant, had been transmitting a distress sweep on a rotating frequency that had, at the moment of our beacon fire, included the same emergency compression frequency. The 2 signals had occupied the same space at the same time and merged into a single burst. That merged burst had propagated outward. It had not reached the Sovereignty's nearest relay, which had been on our nominal heading. It had reached something else, something that had been listening on that frequency, at that range, at that angle. Earth's relay network. I did not know then, and do not know now, the full extent of Earth's passive listening infrastructure in the outer regions of the transit corridors. I know from the subsequent investigation that the merged burst was received by what the humans call a long-range relay monitor, a passive listening post, automated, that does nothing but log signals on emergency frequencies and flag them for analysis. The monitor had received the merged burst, parsed the dual origin coordinates from the collision artifact, and flagged both as active mass casualty events. The flag had propagated to the Compact's emergency dispatch network. The Meridian Compact, a supply convoy that had been underway for a different sector's resupply run, had been within reach and had been diverted. "We did not aim it at Earth," I said. Darrett's voice came back without hesitation. "We know, the collision artifact made that clear. You aimed it at your own relay network. We happened to be listening." A pause. "Does that change your status assessment?" I looked out through the cracked viewport at the 3 ships now visible with the naked eye, close enough to resolve as distinct shapes against the planet's curve below us. The Meridian Compact in the lead, blocky and large, a converted supply hauler with the visible bulk of full loading still on its external rack mounts. The Kara's ward behind it, white-hulled and unmistakable in the configuration of a hospital vessel. And the frigate, smaller, sitting on the convoy's starboard flank at the spacing of a vessel that is not escorting but guarding. The Dravathi cruisers in my peripheral vision were still maneuvering away. "No," I said, "it doesn't change the status assessment. We have 41 wounded, 9 critical. We have 11 days of supplies remaining. We have 4 enemy cruisers and a carrier in the system that have been interdicting us for 26 days. We have a refugee convoy in the outer system that I need to know more about, because you mentioned a second origin point." "The second origin point is 4 light hours out," Darrett said. "We dispatched our courier drone to the coordinates before we made final approach here. It's a convoy, looks like evacuees, 1 ship badly damaged, 2 others in formation with it. They're not in immediate danger, but they need medical support and supplies. We'll address your station first." That was the moment I understood what kind of thing this was going to be. Not a rescue in the ordinary sense, where you call for help and help comes, and the scale of the response is proportionate to the scale of the need. Something else. Something that arrived in 3 ships with a full supply load for a different sector entirely, and then, upon encountering the scope of what it found, began methodically working through all of it. They docked the Meridian Compact to Verath Station's primary docking collar at the 15th hour. The docking took longer than it should have because the docking collar's alignment system had taken minor damage in the first week of the siege, and had been running on a manual workaround since then. And the Meridian Compact's crew approached the process with a patience that I found remarkable. 3 attempts, quiet corrections between their docking team and our technician, no frustration evident in any communication. Just the flat practical efficiency of people who have done difficult docking procedures before and understand that it takes the time it takes. When the collar sealed and the atmosphere equalized and the hatch opened, what came through, it was not what I had been imagining. I had been imagining, in the abstract way that you imagine things when you have been in a siege for 26 days and your frame of reference for everything has narrowed to the dimensions of the station and the people on it, something military, soldiers, an armed relief team. What came through the hatch was a supply crew, 8 humans, 4 of them in the padded overalls of cargo handlers, 2 in the dark trim uniforms of ship's technical staff, 1 in medical coveralls, and 1, in front, in the plain jacket of a convoy commander. Darrett was a human of middle height, compact, with a quality of attention in the face that I recognized as the quality of someone who is processing a great deal of information simultaneously and showing none of it. Behind her, the cargo handlers were already moving. They had brought hand trucks through the hatch, and they were asking our deck technician, in the same flat practical voice I had heard on the channel where she wanted things. I introduced myself. Darrett shook my hand, a human gesture that I was familiar with in theory. In practice, it was firmer than I had expected. She looked at me with the particular directness that I was beginning to understand was simply how humans looked at things when they were paying attention. "Intelligence officer," she said, reading my insignia. "You're the one who answered the hail." "Yes." "You said 9 critical wounded." "Yes." "Dr. Vale is setting up in your medical bay now," she said. "Kara's ward's surgical team is transferring over. They'll need your physician to brief them on the 9. She was already moving, walking with me toward the secondary command room, looking at everything as she walked, not like a tourist, like someone taking inventory. "I need your power layout. We brought a portable coupling generator. Your portside system is running on emergency backup." I told her about the tertiary coupling. She nodded as though this was the kind of information she had been expecting, flagged it on the handheld she was carrying, and sent a text to someone on the Meridian Compact without breaking stride. In the secondary command room, Karen looked at her the way I imagine I had looked at the transponder codes, the expression of a man encountering something his framework was not designed for, deciding to be practically grateful rather than theoretically confused. They shook hands. Darrett looked at the status display, asked 2 questions about the Dravathi ship positions, and then said, "Your sensor coverage on the dorsal arc." "Gone," Karen said. "We can loan you a sensor drone, deployable from your docking collar, passive coverage. It won't replace what you lost, but it'll close the worst of the gap." She looked at the display again. "The 4 cruisers and the carrier. They've been holding at distance since we arrived." "Yes," I said. Darrett looked at me. Something in her face shifted very slightly, not quite a smile, not quite satisfaction, something flatter and harder. "Good," she said. I wanted to ask her what the frigate's instructions were. I wanted to ask what a supply convoy commander understood about the message her escort was sending to 4 Dravathi cruisers and a carrier. I did not ask, because I had enough operational experience to recognize when a question was unnecessary. The Dravathi were holding distance. The message had been received. What followed was 8 hours that I have spent considerable time since trying to reconstruct from my notes, and the docking logs, and the testimony transcripts, because the experience of living through it was not conducive to precise sequential memory. What I have is a series of distinct images, sharp-edged, arranged in an order I am mostly confident is correct. The medical team from the Kara's ward. There were 6 of them, a surgeon, 2 medical officers, 3 technicians, and they moved through the medical bay with the efficiency of people who have set up field surgical operations in unfamiliar spaces before. Our physician, a woman named Tessavaran who had been running on 4 hours of sleep and professional obligation for 26 days, watched them for approximately 30 seconds and then, without a word, began briefing the surgeon on the 9 critical cases. I observed this from the corridor. I observed it because the medical bay was not my space, and because I wanted to see what the briefing looked like from the outside. What it looked like was 2 professionals from different species who had never met before in their lives establishing a working relationship in under 4 minutes on the basis of shared competence and the mutual understanding that there was not time for anything else. The Kara's ward surgeon, I never got her name. She was always either in surgery or in consultation with Tessavaran, and I did not interrupt, began operating within the hour. By the end of the 8 hours, 3 of the 9 had been moved to stable status. The others were improving. The power coupling. The 2 technical staff from the Meridian Compact, both of them in the confident movement of people who work in engineering on a regular basis, went to the portside engineering section with the portable coupling generator and with our chief engineer, a man named Dorvis Kell who had been improvising repairs to the coupling bypass for 11 days, and who I think experienced the arrival of the technical staff as a form of salvation that he had stopped allowing himself to expect. They had the portside systems back to 68% primary power within 4 hours, not fully restored, enough. I passed the engineering section at the 3rd hour and heard, through the open hatch, the 3 of them speaking in the particular technical shorthand of people who have found a common language in the problem itself. The shared notation of a failing system that anyone who has worked with it long enough can read, regardless of what species they are or what relay network their emergency signals are aimed at. The supplies. The cargo handlers from the Meridian Compact moved through the docking collar in a continuous stream. I checked the manifest after the fact. The Meridian Compact had been loaded for a scheduled resupply of a compact agricultural installation, a long-haul, full load, 4 months of provisions for a large population, plus technical equipment. The diversion to Varath Station had not included an unloading stop at the original destination. They had everything. Medical supplies separate from what the Kara's ward carried, in quantity sufficient for our wounded and for resupply of the medical bay's depleted stores. Rations. Water recycler components, which Darrett had flagged separately when I mentioned the Deck 9 leak in passing, and which she had then quietly tasked one of her technical staff to go fix. I discovered this an hour later when I went to check the recycler status, and found a human technician already halfway through the repair, having accessed the recycler housing without any guidance beyond the schematics our chief engineer had handed over without being asked. Fuel cells. Communications equipment, including a portable signal booster that, when our technician installed it in the 2nd hour, pushed our active communication range far enough that we were able to reach the Sovereignty's secondary relay and send a priority status report for the first time in 26 days. The signal booster was the thing that made me understand what we were dealing with, because the signal booster was not on the Meridian Compact's manifest. It was on the Kara's ward's manifest, listed under emergency communication support, which meant someone on the hospital ship had thought to bring it. Someone on the hospital ship had looked at a mass-casualty flag from an orbital defense platform under siege, and decided that communications restoration was part of the medical response. I do not know which of the Kara's ward's crew made that decision. I would like to know, because it is the kind of decision that tells you everything about how a person understands their job. The sensor drone was deployed in the 3rd hour. It was a compact unit, about the size of a maintenance pod, running on its own power cell, and it parked itself 3 kilometers off the station's dorsal hull and began providing passive sensor coverage on a data share frequency that our secondary command room could read without any modification to our existing systems. Karen spent the better part of an hour staring at the sensor feed from the drone, watching the Dravathi ships hold their positions at distance and not saying anything. I understood the silence. It was the silence of a commanding officer who has been flying on instruments in a storm for 26 days and has just, for the first time, seen the horizon. The frigate, I learned its name from the docking logs. The ECV returned purpose, which struck me as a name with a particular kind of deadpan weight to it, held its position on Varath Station's starboard side, oriented toward the Dravathi ships, and did not fire on anything. It did not need to. I monitored the Dravathi power signatures throughout the 8 hours. They held distance. At the 6th hour, one of the 4 cruisers began a slow, careful transit toward the outer system boundary, at a speed and heading that read very clearly as departure. By the end of the 8 hours, a second cruiser had begun the same transit. The carrier and the remaining 2 cruisers were still present, but their posture had shifted so thoroughly from interdiction to what I can only describe as waiting to see that the effective siege was over. At the 7th hour, Darrett found me on the observation deck. I had come back up there, pressure suit and all, because I was not sleeping and I needed to see the outer system with my own eyes. The Kara's ward was still in its holding position. The Meridian Compact was still docked. The returned purpose was still on the starboard flank daylit, the planet's curve below it throwing light up onto the frigate's ventral hull in the amber gray that Varath IV's atmosphere gives everything at this altitude. The light was the same light I had been watching for 26 days. It looked different now in a way I could not immediately explain, and then I understood. It looked the same as it always had, and I was the thing that was different. Darrett stood beside me and looked at the same view. She was wearing a ship suit, not a pressure suit. Either she had not been told about the atmospheric integrity issue, or she had assessed the risk and decided it was acceptable. Given what I had observed of her over the previous 7 hours, I suspected the latter. "The second origin point," I said, "the test of our transit." "Courier drone reached them 4 hours ago," she said. "Dr. Vale went out in the Kara's ward's shuttle with 2 medical technicians and a supply transfer. The Irivant's crew is stable. The evacuees they're tired and they're scared, but they're not dying. The supplies will get them to the inner system." "They never contacted Earth either," I said. "The test of our transit." "No," Darrett said. "Their signal and your signal hit the same frequency at the same time and merged. Our relay parsed both origin points out of the collision artifact and flagged both as mass casualty. We came to both." She paused. "Neither one of you called us. That's in the report I'll file." I looked at her. "You file reports?" "Convoy commanders file reports. It's a lot of the job." I looked back at the outer system. 2 Dravathi cruisers were gone. The other 2 and the carrier were holding. The returned purpose was where it had been for 7 hours. "We didn't call you," I said. "We didn't know you were listening. We don't have a treaty with the Compact. We've never had contact with Earth's military forces. We have no entry for Varath Station in your records." "We didn't have an entry," Darrett said. "We have one now." I thought about what that meant. An intelligence officer thinks about what things mean. It is a professional habit that does not turn off, even at altitude, even in a pressure suit, even when you have been awake for most of 26 days. What it meant was that Earth's relay network had been listening on the emergency compression frequency at sufficient range to receive a merged burst that had not been aimed at it. That the relay had been sophisticated enough to parse dual origin coordinates from a collision artifact, and that whatever was on the other end of that parsing had looked at the result and dispatched a loaded convoy from a different mission without waiting for confirmation from anyone. "How long," I said, "has your relay been listening in this region?" Darrett was quiet for a moment. The quiet had a quality of precision to it, the quality of someone deciding exactly how much of an answer to give. "A while," she said. I nodded. In intelligence work, a while is an answer. It tells you that the question has a longer answer that you are not going to receive, which tells you that the longer answer is known and that someone has decided it is not for you. I filed that away. It went into my report under a section I labeled Passive Monitoring Infrastructure, Extent Unknown, Assessment Pending. The supplies that were meant for your original destination, I said, the agricultural installation. They'll get resupplied. We're already coordinating a follow-on run from the next available convoy. They'll be short for how long? Darrett looked at me sideways briefly, with an expression that I cannot fully categorize but that contained something like respect for the question. 6 weeks, she said. Maybe 8, they know. They understood when the diversion was authorized. 6 to 8 weeks short of supplies for an agricultural installation, because the convoy that was supposed to serve them had been diverted to a station and a refugee transit that had never asked for them. That installation had not called Earth either. That installation had been part of Earth's operational responsibilities and had accepted the delay without knowing who had received their convoy instead. I added that to the section of my report that I was, by now, mentally filing under things that require further consideration. The Dravathi departed fully at the 31st hour after the Meridian Compact's docking. I was in the secondary command room when the last of their ships, the carrier, which had held its position longest, began its transit toward the outer system boundary. Karen watched the sensor feed. I watched Karen. He looked like a man who was not yet ready to believe it was over, which was appropriate, because until the carrier was past the outer system's transit boundary, it was not, technically, over. At the 33rd hour, the carrier crossed the boundary. Karen sat down in his chair, which he had been standing in front of for most of the previous 30 hours, and was quiet for approximately 2 minutes. Intelligence assessment, he said finally. They're gone, I said. The presence of the escort frigate changed their calculus. They were configured for siege operations, not for engagement with an armed response force. They had no orders for the latter. I thought about what I was not saying and decided to say it, and they knew what Earth Compact Registry meant. Karen looked at me. Do you know what Earth Compact Registry means? I'm learning, I said. The Meridian Compact remained docked for 4 more days, not because the unloading required that long but because Darrett and her crew stayed to assist with the power coupling restoration, the communications array recalibration. They identified the 4-degree offset in the first hour of the survey and fixed it in the second, a job that our technical staff had known needed doing and had not had the parts to do, and the completion of the medical stabilization for the critical wounded. By the time the Meridian Compact undocked, all 9 of the critical wounded had been moved to stable status. Tessevar shook hands with the Kara's ward surgeon in the docking collar, and then, as the hatch sealed, sat down on a crate of supplies in the corridor and did not move for a very long time. I gave her the time. She had been keeping 9 people alive on 4 hours of sleep for 26 days, and then working alongside a surgical team for another 4. And the fact that she was sitting down in a corridor rather than a bunk was, I suspected, the particular decompression of someone who cannot quite make themselves go through the full sequence of returning to normal, because they are not yet entirely sure it is permitted. I checked on her twice. Both times she told me she was fine. The second time I believed her. The Kara's ward departed 12 hours before the Meridian Compact. I watched it go from the observation deck. The returned purpose stayed until the Meridian Compact was ready, then fell into position alongside it, and the 2 ships transited out of the system together. The transition from present to gone was, as it always is, instantaneous. One moment the ships were visible against the planet curve, the next the space they had occupied was simply space again. At the moment they cleared the system's transit boundary, Varath Station's observation deck was very quiet. The viewport crack was still there. We would not have the materials to properly repair it for another 3 weeks, until the sovereignty's own relief convoy finally arrived. And through the sealed emergency foam and the patch material and the original cracked plex, the outer system was empty. I stood there for a while, long enough that the planet below completed a measurable arc in its rotation, the Terminator line shifting visibly against the night side. Long enough that the light on the hull plating of the station's exterior, the parts I could see in reflection against the viewport, moved from the amber gray of mid-altitude afternoon toward something cooler, the planet's shadow beginning to creep across the lower quadrant. Long enough that the secondary command room tried to reach me twice on the comm, and I answered both times and said I was on the observation deck and would be down shortly. I was trying to do something that intelligence officers are trained to do, and that I was finding, on this occasion, genuinely difficult: convert experience into analysis. To take what I had seen and heard and understood over the previous 4 days and translate it into the kind of structured assessment that a report requires. The problem was not that I lacked data. The problem was that the data kept resolving into something that was not quite a conclusion and not quite a question, but something between the two, the shape of a thing I could see clearly and could not yet name. 3 ships. A loaded convoy for a different destination, a hospital, an escort that did not fire a single shot and did not need to, a signal booster that someone had thought to bring, a recycler repair completed quietly without being asked, a communications array recalibrated in 2 hours by people who had never seen it before, 9 critical wounded, all stable, 26 days of siege ended. None of it aimed at Earth. None of it sent, requested, or negotiated. All of it answered by Earth, quietly, completely, and without waiting to be thanked. I went back to the secondary command room and started writing notes, because I knew I was going to have to file a report, and I had already begun to understand that the report was going to be difficult. The Sovereignty's relief convoy arrived 22 days after the Meridian Compact's departure. 4 ships, 2 supply vessels, a medical transport, and a military escort. The commanding officer of the military escort, a senior captain named Veteran Kale, reviewed the station's status and the supply inventory and the medical reports and the communications logs and the power coupling repair records. And then he asked me, in the way that senior officers ask questions when they already know the answer is going to be complicated, what had happened. I told him all of it: the beacon misfire, the 4-degree offset, the Tessevar transit, the collision of the 2 signals on the emergency compression frequency, the merged burst, Earth's relay parsing the dual origin coordinates, the 3 Earth compact ships, the 8 hours of resupply and medical support and the power coupling repair and the signal booster and the sensor drone, the Drevatha's departure, all of it. Kale was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Earth." "Earth," I said. "They have no treaty with the sovereignty." "No. They have no recorded interests in the Verath system." "They do now," I said, and then I thought about Darrett saying the same thing about the entry in their records, and I understood, in a way that I had not quite understood before, what that exchange had meant. We had not been in Earth's records. We were now. The record ran both directions. Kale looked at the docking log. He looked at the manifest of what the Meridian Compact had offloaded. He looked at the medical reports showing the 9 critical wounded, all stable. He looked at the communications log showing the moment we had reached the Sovereignty's secondary relay after the signal booster was installed, 51 minutes into the Meridian Compact's docking. "The agricultural installation," he said, "the one that was their original destination. Undersupplied for 6 to 8 weeks, I said. They arranged a follow-on resupply from their own network. For one of their own installations." "Yes." He was quiet again. Then, in the tone of a senior officer who has encountered something that does not fit his operational framework and has decided to be practical about it, "Your report." "Filed 43 days after the siege broke," I said. Communications anomaly with compound origin, an unsolicited third-party intervention. He looked at the categorization for a moment. That covers it. It covers the mechanics, I said. It doesn't cover the rest. What's the rest? I thought about Darrett standing at the cracked viewport in her ship suit, telling me the second origin point had been handled. I thought about the Kara's ward's surgeon and Tessevar on standing in the medical bay at 2 in the morning by station time, working through the 9th critical case. I thought about the signal booster on the Kara's ward's manifest, the one that someone had decided was part of the medical response. I thought about the returned purpose sitting on our starboard side, not firing on anything, not needing to. The merged signal reached their relay, I said. 2 SOS bursts that had never been aimed at Earth, that collided by accident on a frequency their passive network was monitoring, at a range they had no announced interest in covering, on a heading that happened to be the vector of our beacon's miscalibration. They parsed both origin points. They diverted a loaded convoy from a different mission. They came to both. Kale waited. We didn't call them, I said. Neither did the Tessevar transit. Nobody aimed anything at Earth. The signals crossed by accident, merged by physics, propagated on a vector we didn't intend and reached a relay network we didn't know was there. And then 3 ships came, with everything. I paused. The report covers the mechanics. The rest of it is something I don't have a category for. Kale looked at me for a moment with the expression of a senior officer who has decided, for practical reasons, not to pursue a line of analysis that is going to be above his pay grade to resolve. File an addendum, he said. Flag it for the Strategic Assessment Office. I filed the addendum. I flagged it for the Strategic Assessment Office. I do not know what the Strategic Assessment Office did with it. I know it was received because I received a confirmation of receipt. Beyond that, my involvement ended. What I know, on the 43rd day, sitting in the secondary command room of Verath Station above Verath IV, with the power coupling back to nominal, and the viewport repaired, and the 9 critical wounded all on recovery track and the Dravathi long gone, is this. We did not call Earth. The Tessevar transit did not call Earth. 2 signals that were never aimed at Earth crossed in space, merged by accident, and were received by a network that was listening on a frequency we did not know anyone was monitoring, at a range we did not know anyone was covering. The network parsed 2 sets of coordinates from the collision artifact and sent what it had. What it had was a loaded convoy, a hospital ship, and an armed escort that held station long enough for the Dravathi to decide that their operational calculus had changed. The sector that the Meridian Compact had been meant to resupply waited 6 weeks. They understood. They had been told. An agricultural installation managed its supplies carefully for 6 weeks because the convoy that was supposed to come to them had been diverted to 2 sets of coordinates that Earth's relay had parsed from an accidental signal collision in a sector Earth had no treaty rights in and no announced interests in and no reason to be listening to. None of this was aimed at Earth. None of this was asked of Earth. In my report, I called it a communications anomaly with compound origin. In the addendum, I called it something I don't have a category for. In my own notes, which are not filed and not flagged and not going to the Strategic Assessment Office, I have tried 3 different formulations and crossed them all out. What I keep coming back to in the end is something Darrett said on the observation deck. Not the thing about the entry in their records, though that stays with me. The thing before it. Neither one of you called us. That's in the report I'll file. She said it without apology and without pride. The way you state a fact that has no emotional charge, but that needs to be on the record because the record is how things stay true. The signal that reached Earth was an accident. The response to it was not. Those are 2 separate things, and Darrett, who files reports for a living and understands the difference between mechanics and meaning, wanted both of them in the record. I wanted both of them in my record too. This is my best attempt. The 43rd day. Varath Station still standing. 9 critical wounded, all stable. The system quiet. Neither one of us called them. They came anyway.